I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
President Richard Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, culminating a different period in our nation's history due to the devastating experience of the Vietnam War. Nixon, along with Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Ford, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, were the primary leaders and architects of U.S. Vietnam War policy. Over a span of 20 years, these leaders committed U.S. troops to a war that became largely understood as unwinnable, and yet they continued with their war policies, drafting more young men to serve and receiving more traumatized veterans home. The leaders of the Vietnam era knowingly misled the American public about the war, which resulted in a legacy of distrust between people and government, and destabilized political efficacy for generations. Vietnam, the small country in Southeast Asia, had strategic importance in American foreign policy because of its geographic proximity to then-communist Russia and China. The U.S. feared a domino effect where other countries in the region would also adopt communism and form an alliance against the U.S. Having recently experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis, the threat of communism seemed like a true danger to American leaders. During World War II, the United States supported the French colony of Vietnam in their fight against the Japanese. But after the war, Vietnam wanted independence from France and requested assistance from the United States. However, the leader of the nationalist Vietnamese government, Ho Chi Minh, was a communist, and the U.S. did not want to support him as it could lead to communist expansion in the region. Finally, a 1954 agreement separated Vietnam into a communist north and an anti-communist south. To prevent the spread of communism, President Eisenhower sent hundreds of military advisors and $1 billion to support South Vietnam. President Kennedy increased the number of advisors and tripled U.S. financial support. U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War escalated further during the Johnson administration, when the American public was told that U.S. Navy ships had been attacked in the South Pacific by North Vietnam and the U.S. needed to retaliate.
Hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action.
Between 1956 and 1957, more than 3.4 million American troops served in Vietnam. 350,000 were wounded and disabled, and almost 60,000 soldiers died. Many Vietnamese civilians also died in the crossfire, and the horrors of the war were felt both at home and abroad. While North Vietnam was the target of repeated U.S. bombings, much of the fighting occurred in the mountains, highlands, swampy marshes, rivers, jungles, forests, rice paddy fields, and highly populated city streets of South Vietnam, all during the burning hot sun or the endless rainy seasons. Surprise attacks on American troops killed entire platoons, and small villages were massacred but for an orphaned baby. One thing that became clear over time was that the Russian-backed communist Viet Cong forces of North Vietnam would never accept defeat, that they would rather sacrifice their lives, their people, and their homes, but they would not surrender their country to a foreign government. They would continue fighting for a united Vietnam free of foreign occupation. The violence and death of the war was accepted by the Vietnamese as the price for pursuing their independence, while it was a sacrifice U.S. leaders were willing to make in order to contain the communist threat. As the fighting and suffering continued, our leaders became increasingly aware that no amount of troops could topple the will of the nationalist government of North Vietnam, but still continued to commit American troops and risk human lives.
We saw Vietnam as an element of the Cold War, not what they saw it as, a civil war. We were wrong.
In 1967, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara commissioned a study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. One of the principal writers, Daniel Ellsberg, a Harvard graduate and former Marine, discovered evidence that U.S. leaders were deceiving the American public about the Vietnam War.
It was an American war from the start. President Truman financed the French to retake its former colony, even though he knew the French were fighting a national movement that had the support of the people. It wasn't that we were on the wrong side. We were the wrong side. It was a crime from the start. carried out by 4 presidents is revealed in this study. And now a 5th president was doing the same, with no end in sight.
Ellsberg was convinced the leaders would continue the war despite the heavy tolls. Worse yet, the leaders reassured Americans that everything was on track. The public was being deceived in order to practice the containment policy. Ellsberg had a professional responsibility to keep confidentiality, but he felt a patriotic duty to share the truth. He ultimately leaked the study, also known as the Pentagon Papers, to the New York Times, and finally the public learned about the truth.
I walked into this hotel room when he and I hold up, and Neil says, "Rick, look at what we've got." And I mean, it was just staggering. The raw, top secret, eyes-only documents, from Earl Wheeler to General Westmoreland, and from Johnson to Taylor. You can go back and see, yes, Kennedy did send in troops in violation of the Geneva Accord. Yes, Johnson did start the build-up before he said he was going to. I remember writing this story. These guys were lying through their teeth when they were talking to us. And here it is in black and white. There's no way of denying it.
Walter Cronkite, who was called the most trusted man in America at the time, covered the story along with many other news outlets.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see, brought cries of outrage from Washington.
The Pentagon Papers make it abundantly clear how little the public knew of what was going on behind the scenes during its main effect is to refute the notion that we stumbled into the war.
After the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press, anti-war protests intensified. The greatest objection was towards the continued draft lottery. The way the draft worked is every day of the year had a slip of paper put in the bowl to represent a birthday.
First pick tonight is September 14th, the first birthday that now is designated 001, which means for 19-year-olds born on September 14th, that beginning in January, local draft boards will induct those men born on September 14th.
The draft became an aspect of the war that heavily affected American families of all backgrounds. A lottery number could seal a young man's fate or keep him safe at home. If he was forced to go to Vietnam, he would be facing death, disease, or irreversible injury. Another source of tension was the experience of veterans once they returned home. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress, addiction problems, and disabilities. In addition, because of the perceived failure of the Vietnam War, they did not feel like they returned home as heroes, but as outcasts in society. Vets also faced workplace discrimination, which led to homelessness and struggling to get by. Despite these awful consequences for people who served our country, the leaders continued the Vietnam policy, knowing that many more would share the same fate. Distrust in government caused people to protest. Americans were not new to the idea of using political protests to influence public policy. They believed that they could show the government how they felt, and then government would make public policy guided by the people. This illustrates high political efficacy and a strong democracy. Yet, since the Vietnam era, political participation has declined. Ultimately, many believe that the vast war protests during the Vietnam War did indeed help end the war, but the secrets around the Vietnam War began a legacy of distrust between the people and government, as the war policy so publicly revealed human life to be sacrificed in the interest of foreign policy, which left the public feeling shocked and deceived. An essential aspect of democracy is the trust between people and the government. When that trust is shaken, it affects individuals' willingness to share their political opinions, civic voices, and undermines political efficacy, weakening our democracy. Oftentimes, we think about the historical legacies that our leaders have left behind. We think of the important developments and beneficial social change. However, it is equally important to recognize the times when our leaders have engaged in actions that may have left a legacy to learn from. In the case of the Vietnam era, the leaders of this time made decisions without keeping the public informed and without the public's support, leading to a legacy of shattered trust and crumbling efficacy.